Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Saskatchewan Provincial Insect Update and Gopher Control going into 2023 webinar. My name is Harjot Thur, and I'm the Crops Extension Intern with Saskatchewan Agriculture in Outlook, and will be chairing today's event. CEUs are being offered for CCAs on this webinar. In order to get credit, you need to attend the entire live event, and there will be a QR code at the end of the presentation to collect credit. If you missed the code and have attended live, please email us afterwards and we can work with you to get your credit. This event qualifies for CEUs towards CCSC certification, but sign-in sheets are not required to be filled in. Certified crop science consultants wishing to collect CEUs for today's session may submit a CEU request through the CCSC program self-reporting database at ccsctracking.ca. Today's presentation will be followed with a live Q&A session with James Tansey. The main hub for today will be your webinar screen, and we will share relevant downloadable handouts with you in the chat box area. The entire session will be recorded, so if you miss anything or wish to revisit any of the presentations, you will be able to. Recording links will be sent out later today in a follow-up email. An evaluation will pop up at the end of the webinar this morning. Please ensure that you fill out the evaluation, as these help us determine what topics you want to learn more and help us prioritize research needs for the future. We plan on having several webinars this winter on topics including a 2023 disease update and herbicide resistance, which you can watch out for on the Saskatchewan Agriculture online calendar of events or by following us on social media. We also have a handout attached with more information on dates and registration. If you have any questions, please reach out to your local regional office or to the Agriculture Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377. We have a few housekeeping notes to keep in mind during the webinar. If anybody has any questions during any of the presentations, you may type them in the question box in the bottom right-hand side of the control panel. We will try to get as many of your questions as possible, but may need to limit them due to time. Your questions will remain anonymous and will only be sent to me. During the presentation, you will be muted so that we can ensure there is no feedback that will interfere with the audio. We will start the day off with James Tansey, Provincial Pest Management Specialist with Saskatchewan Agriculture, who will give an update on the 2022 Field Crop Insect Report and also Gopher Control going into 2023. James has been with the Ministry of Agriculture as a pest management specialist since 2018. Prior to this, he worked in row crops entomology research in Alberta and citrus systems in Florida, pharmaceutical research in Idaho on house dust mites and regulatory affairs. He is interested in all aspects of insect-plant interactions. We will start whenever you're ready, James.
Excellent, thank you. Can you see my screen? I've had a window pop up that seems to be interfering with my screen sharing.
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So let me turn my camera on. Okay, excellent. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I'll get right into it. We have a fair bit of material to cover. So we will be talking about, as indicated, pest populations in Saskatchewan, what we saw in the past year, and looking a bit into our forecast for 2023 or for the coming field season. So grasshoppers, of course, friend of mine to a lot of people. We did have localized heavy pressure in 2022 with multiple applications going down on several sites, primarily in central regions and western regions, southwestern regions. Slightly lesser pressure in eastern regions, but we still had some economic populations in those areas as well. We're looking at 4 species of economically important grasshoppers in the province. Important consideration, and maybe not well appreciated, is that we actually have 85 species of grasshoppers in the province. The vast majority of these are non-economic pests. They're just happily munching on other plants that are not of economic importance to agriculture. Pardon me. So just starting from the top, clearwing is a cereal specialist, like a grass specialist. So this one can be a devastating pest for wheat and for other cereals, but is of less importance for forbs. So that is for lusher plants, canola, soybean, etc. Migratory or lesser migratory is actually a complex of species, about 3 different species, all closely related, all get lumped into the migratory category. But when we're talking about lesser migratory grasshopper and its close relatives, it is a real garbage guts. So I mean, it's host preferences. Yes.
Seems like your slides aren't progressing. Maybe you want to switch the slides. Your presentation. It's okay, still on the first page.
Oh, is it? Again, I have this window that seems to be interfering with things that's popped up.
You want to maybe try posting it again?
I'm sorry, what? Can you repeat yourself, please?
Do you mind posting it again? Like maybe exit out and then start the presentation again, maybe? Maybe that works.
It's not as simple as that in this format, so. Here, just a moment. Pardon us, everyone. I'm just going to turn my.
There you go. Oh, yeah.
Okay, can you see my presentation now?
We can see the presentation, yes.
Okay. Full screen?
We're still on the first page here.
Yeah, but is it full screen?
Yeah, it is full screen, yeah.
Super. Second screen.
There you go.
I know, excellent. Okay, thank you. Yes. Thanks everyone for your patience. So once again, localized heavy pressure 2022. We'll talk a little bit about clearwing and some of the other species, and why this is important is they actually there's difference in regional prevalence of these animals in these different species, and they have different host preferences. So if you take a look at that link down there, I ask that people go to this. This is a webinar that we've assembled for species identification and some of the discussion of host plant preferences that can have a significant impact on your control decisions. So we'll talk briefly about some of these species. Clearwing at the top there, again, cereal specialist. Significant problem for cereals, not much of a problem for broadleaf plants. So you can actually see significant numbers of these animals in crops that are non-host crops. Oftentimes they'll just be sunning themselves. They like to increase their internal temperature, and you know, to the mid 30s. They're real heat lovers. So you can see them basking on plants without actually feeding on them. Migratory, again, real garbage guts, so a very broad host range, very little that they will not eat, including other insects. They will cannibalize each other under the right conditions, and feed on a number of different crop species. Packards, a little bit more selective. These ones really prefer legumes. Not much of an issue in grasses, again, unless push comes to shove. And two-striped, which is our most prevalent grasshopper species in the province. This one prefers lusher crops, so broadleaf crops. However, it will feed on cereals, and it's a bit of a notorious stem clipper. Pardon me, a bit of a notorious stem clipper. So it will actually climb up onto stems and cut the stems, reducing the yield of cereal crops. So host preference is very important. I ask that people go to this webinar link and find more information on these animals, including some diagnostic cues. You can see they look different, but we illustrate some of the things that you should look for to be able to differentiate these species. Looking at the forecast for next year, and we'll talk about that in context of what we saw this year. The forecast is or our prediction for the upcoming year is based in large part on modeling that was done by Owen Olfert from 2020. So conditions that are really important to the development of grasshopper populations include a warm spring. So warm, dry conditions in the spring will influence their. I need to turn my telephone off. Will influence their how quickly they speed through their development. In the winter, they overwinter as eggs, and they spend this time in a state called diapause. So it's a little bit like hibernation, but nothing like hibernation, if that makes sense. So they're in a state of arrested development. So the eggs are laid in the late summer, and they develop as long as conditions are favorable. So temperature conditions, above about 5 degrees Celsius. And then once the conditions fall below that, then that development is stopped. It gets started again in the spring once conditions are favorable, and those are associated with temperature. So we get a warm spring, they continue that development, and they can hatch a little bit earlier. So typically, I mean, we're looking mid-May, end of May for the hatching time of most of these animals. So what this means is that if you see grasshoppers with wings in the spring, these are not pests. They can be numerous, but they don't really represent a threat. It's good to keep an eye on things, but oftentimes, you're going to be seeing animals like speckled rangeland grasshopper, which, pretty, decent size grasshopper, red hind wings, noisy flyer, not a pest, but it can be pretty numerous in large parts of the province, especially in the spring. So, warmer, drier conditions, of course, these animals are ectotherms. The temperature is going to dictate how quickly they're moving through their development. So you get the rapid development of eggs, rapid development or rapid hatch, or earlier hatch, rapid development of nymphs, and speeding through to adulthood. And the conditions from last year that are really going to impact this year are what happened in July and August. So if you've got heavy populations, you got a lot of opportunity for boys to meet girls and to contribute to the next generation, get lots of eggs into the ground. And if you got warm, dry conditions and late summer, early fall, then they can keep ovipositing through those periods and get a lot of eggs into the ground. And of course, we saw those conditions in a number of parts of the province. So looking at the survey from 2022, and this contributes to our 2023 forecast. You can see a real hotspot in central regions extending into the south. We do get comments on this map fairly regularly that, hey, my place was very high populations and it's not really represented in this map. It's important to consider that this is a smoothing map. So it will average out some of those localized hotspots. So really what you're seeing is a regional look at things. However, if your place has had a significant number of grasshoppers, you could be, if you're in this area that was characterized by drought conditions in Saskatchewan, be looking forward to elevated populations this spring and be prepared for that. So grasshopper populations are influenced by natural enemies, and we'll talk about three big groups here. One is pathogens, so Entomothera grillii is a good representative of that one. And you can see on the left there, this is a clearwing grasshopper who has been obliged by this fungal pathogen to climb to the top of this plant, grab on for dear life, and die. And because of the nature of their exoskeletons, they really just lock into place. The fungus is going to continue to develop inside that animal, and it's going to rain fungal spores down on all of his pals and infect that population. So typically, Entomothera isn't going to knock down regional populations, to a huge extent, but you can get really significant local effects, individual field effects, to the point where you can get millions of grasshoppers dying off in a field, to the point where you can smell these things for, a mile driving up to these things. They're large, meaty animals, and when large numbers of them die, they stink. We'll look next at the top right, the blister beetles. These are in the genus Epicota, the big gray guys. There are also black ones in the genus Epicota that are important predators of grasshopper eggs. The ones that you see that are black with purpley metallic sheen, those are actually called Nuttall's blister beetle, and they're more interested in solitary bees than in grasshoppers. But Epicota blister beetles, these gray ones especially, they lay their eggs. They're good. The females are good at finding grasshopper eggs, and they'll lay their eggs near where grasshoppers have laid their eggs. eggs hatch, and if you look at that little figure below the picture of the adult there, you can see the larvae, and great diversity of forms in the larvae. This is all from one species, so it's a fascinating animal. Just the different changes that go through with every molt. So the little monster looking one on the left, that's called a triungulin larva. And that's the first instar larva. That's the business end when you're a grasshopper. So those are going to hatch. They're very small, and they're going to seek out grasshopper eggs and happily munch on them. The adults do not feed on grasshopper eggs, so they're happy to munch on flowers. Typically not economically important. Can be important for small plot research because it tends to concentrate their populations. But typically in a field of in a commercial field, they will not be economically important. Field crickets can be important natural enemies of grasshoppers as well, and they happily munch on eggs. So we've got two species of field crickets: spring field cricket, fall field cricket, active at fairly obvious times of year. And finally, we have parasites. And you can see there's a worm there that's, we'll say, closely associated with that cricket. What it has done is functionally exploded out the butt of the cricket. There's no delicate way to say that. So large insects make for large parasites, and you can see that as a very large worm if you're an insect. So large insects, crickets, grasshoppers, blister beetles, carrion beetles, predatory beetles are all parasitized by this worm. It's an aquatic worm, so if you've been to the lake and seen large filamentous worms swimming through the water, these are what are called horsehair worms, and this is the adult stage, and so they are aquatic. They seek out water. They lay their eggs in water, and the insect will imbibe the water. Eggs will be consumed with that. Those eggs will hatch and find their way to the hemocoel of the blood cavity of the insect. So if you think of an insect, it's a tube within a tube. So you have the gut, and then this fluid-filled area around it called the hemocoel or blood cavity, and then its exoskeleton. So the worm lives in the hemocoel. Once it's time for it to reproduce, it obliges its host to seek water. Once that host finds water, the worm explodes out and finds its way to the water. This one, however, was a dead end for both the cricket and the worm. This happened on my driveway under very dry conditions. So things don't always work out in these systems for either animal. Cutworms, these are generalists. Most of what we saw this year were redback, some pale western. We did have cool, wet conditions over many regions of the province in the spring, and this contributed likely to a reduction in pressures associated with these cutworms. Some areas of the Southwest saw some elevated pressures with cutworms. Areas that experience dry conditions. They can outbreak in very large numbers, again associated with dry conditions. And uncultivated fields with broadleaf weeds, they are generalists. They can feed on a number of different plant species. The females are happy to lay their eggs on a number of different broadleaf weeds, and they're hedging their bet on the following year. So weed control can be important for limiting their impact. Wheat midge is the next animal that we'll talk about. We'll talk a bit about the 2022 forecast and the 2021 survey, which suggested that we weren't looking forward to much in the way of wheat midge pressure. However, and this is the big however, we still had background populations. So albeit, we were looking at the 300 and less per square meter, which is still a lot of wheat midge. We had timely rains in a number of parts of the province. So about 25 millimeters of rain prior to the end of May will stimulate the continued development of these larvae. They overwinter in the soil as larvae. You're relatively deep if you're a wheat midge, 4 or 5 inches. The rains, when they reach them, will stimulate them to finish their development and pupate. They'll move up to the soil surface or near the soil surface, pupate there, and then the adult swarm will emerge once degree days accumulate. And the degree day modeling indicates that they typically come up right around Canada Day. So what will complicate monitoring for these, and that is the daily counts at sunset so that you can see them, is they can emerge over a period of weeks. So it's not a short, sharp emergence, and that emergence can be protracted. The females really like to spread their eggs around. So 1 midge to 4 to 5 heads is the yield threshold for grade. 1 midge to 8 to 10 heads. We still have 2 products or 2 active ingredients on the books. Dimethoate, in the form of Lagon Saigon, and chlorpyrifos, and as an example of that, Lorspan. We have removed a couple of chlorpyrifos products from the Guide to Crop Protection. There are still some on the books that can be used until December of this year. However, purchase is not permitted for this year. So if you have them in store, you can still use them up until this field season. But this is the last year for chlorpyrifos use for this purpose. Dimethoate is less effective as an ovicide, so less effective at killing eggs than chlorpyrifos. So our current recommendation is to look at varietal blends with the SM1 gene. And there are a number of different varieties of wheat and durum available with this trait. So please look for those. Contact our provincial cereal specialist, Sarah, to get more detailed information on those. Looking at the wheat mid forecast for 2023, as I mentioned before, timely rains contributed to an increase in population, and these hot spots coincide pretty nicely with the occurrence of those spring rains. So we're looking at elevated populations this year, and so it's important for growers to be on the lookout. If you haven't or you're not considering purchasing SM1 varietal blends, to scout right around that Canada Day time. So. Cereal aphids, we're looking at 4 main species. All of these blow in from the US. So the 2 primaries are English grain aphid and bird cherry oat aphid. We do occasionally get green bug and haven't seen corn leaf aphid in a few years. However, they can occur here. We had several accounts of, sorry, did everyone see that glitch? Sorry, can everyone still see my slide? My computer's being a little glitchy right now.
Yeah, we can see your screen, James, but it's not in the presentation mode yet.
Oh, sorry, I'm flashing between presentations here. Is something happening at the other end there? Or?
James, do you want me to put it on my screen?
Yeah, let me try this. Okay, so can you see it now? I think my computers, as a rule, tend to like to default to toaster, so mine would like to be a toaster this morning. It seems to be working well now, though. So, oh, never mind. Yeah, Ali, if you could put it up. Mine's gone into toaster mode again. So.
Can you guys see that okay?
Yeah, I can see it fine.
And which slide were you on again there?
Go down to cereal aphids. Yeah, okay, that's good. So we had several accounts of spraying for 2022. Once you get to that soft dose stage, though, you're out of the woods. The plants are relatively tolerant or very tolerant of aphid damage. At that point, so I'm going to put things on another screen so it's a little more accessible and less distracting with my other screen losing its mind. Apologies, everyone. So once you get to that soft dose stage, little effect on yields, significant effect of natural enemies. So when you're small and delicious like an aphid, having not tasted them myself, but there are a number of predators that will feed on these specialist parasitoids. Next slide, please. Excellent, thank you. So yeah, English grain aphid typically at the top of plants. Bird cherry oat aphid tends to be a little bit lower on plants. Thresholds are the same. For cereals, 10 to 12 aphids per stem prior to soft dose, so that soft dose stage really important. Canary seed, 10 to 20 aphids on 50% of stems prior to soft dose. Next slide, please. Excellent. Oh, no, the view has changed. Great, thank you. Wheat stem sawfly. We have been getting some anecdotal reports of populations, and I'm gonna highlight the word anecdotal. So we are looking at having a formal survey for wheat stem sawfly in the province of Saskatchewan, and we're hoping to move that forward for the upcoming season. Dry weather cycles and tight wheat rotations contribute to populations of these animals, and they really prefer spring wheat. They will feed on winter wheat, but yeah, spring wheat is really their preferred host. Larval feeding is the business end of this animal. 5 to 15% reduction in seed weight can be attributed to feeding by larvae, and stem cutting is the most important issue with the larvae. So they're going to go to that first node, chew around that first node, and plug it with frass, so plant material and frass, and that plant will flop over. So of course that's going to make harvesting that plant very difficult, contribute to lodging. Next slide, please. So for control, we don't recommend spraying. If you are out there sweeping and you see significant numbers of wheat stem sawfly adults, the jig is up. So those eggs are in the plants. It is a year-to-year management that we recommend. So if 10 to 15% cutting is demonstrated 1 year, then consider a non-host crop or a semi-solid variety. There are solid stem varieties and semi-solid varieties, and these limit the development and the movement of larvae through the development of pith, and some can be very effective. Stem strength and stand density can also contribute to, we'll say, not necessarily yield recovery, but yield preservation, even under high pressure. So you get dense stands; those can hold up plants that have actually been cut and allow them to be harvested. The yield won't quite be the same, obviously, but you won't lose them entirely. Next slide, please. On to canola pests. So cabbage seed pod weevil, 3 to 4 millimeters as adults. You can see on the top right there, very characteristic animal. You can see the long rostrum or snout on them. They're an invasive pest. So they were first documented in Western Canada or in the prairies in 1995. By 2000, they'd reached Saskatchewan. They've now found their way all the way to Manitoba, and have in recent years been moving their range further north as well. Their true hosts are canola, brown mustard, and wild mustard. And when I say true host, this is something where a plant that will allow them, the larvae, to develop. They have some food hosts as well, which is a lot of different plants in the Brassicaceae. They really, really like flicksweed. So if you want to see what's happening with this population early season, look in the ditches for flicksweed, because that will concentrate their populations. Adult feeding, bud blast, it can be attributed to adult feeding, especially under hot conditions, but the bulk of the damage is associated with larval feeding. And you note that there's only one larvae in this pod, and reason being is they are cannibals. They don't get along very well with each other at all. They're very territorial. Reason being, the inside of a pod and the seeds that are contained inside that pod, pretty limited resources. They're not moving from pod to pod, so they get what they get from the time the egg is laid. So what this female is going to do, she's going to chew a little hole in that pod, turn around, lay an egg in there, and deposit what's called an oviposition deterring pheromone. So that dissuades other females from laying eggs in there, and prevents competition, prevents both these animals, both the larvae from being killed through fighting. Once this animal completes development as a larva, it's going to chew its way out of the pod, fall to the soil, and pupate. So both those oviposition holes and the exit holes are avenues for pathogens and make the pod more prone to shatter as well. Overwintering adults can also be very numerous and contribute to damage. Unfortunately, we don't have thresholds for those. Next slide, please. Excellent, thanks. So looking at the population for 2021, of course, we had very dry conditions in the Southwest, and you can see that the populations didn't do very well. So poor host plant quality leads to reduced pest populations. So not necessarily a happy story if you're not getting yields off those fields anyway. But the take home from this is you look at the darker green and how far north it extends in 2021 and 2020 and how far east, and you look at 2022, and we've seen a real retraction in their northern range and a relative reduction in the population densities as well. So exactly what's happening with these populations, don't quite know yet, but we are seeing a reduction. So keep in mind they are invasive. Any retraction in their populations is always good news. Next slide, please. Diamondback moth, this animal's migratory. So it's going to spend its winters in Florida. So it probably enjoys that. In Florida and Texas, northern Mexico, these are the regions that are typically connected to the central prairies where we're at, with high altitude winds. So these, sorry, there's a cursor moving over the screen, so it's a little distracting. Thank you. So they're going to migrate from these southern reaches of their range to the northern reaches of their range, which is where we're at. So the migration isn't stepwise. So they don't set off from Florida and travel 20 miles, 30 miles, whatever, stepwise. They take to the air when winter crops that are grown in that area. So in Florida, Texas, northern Mexico, they grow cold crops, broccoli and cabbage, and a little bit of canola in Georgia. And so when harvest time comes, which coincides nicely with our spring, large numbers of these animals are going to take to the air, and they're going to get into high altitude currents of air. So typically they're following the warm air, so roughly 300 to 500 meters, but they're sensitive to the temperatures, and they will actually follow these as high as 4 kilometers in the air. So 4,000 meters. They can fly relatively high, get pushed along by winds. So that means that these winds can push them great distances, as much as 1,000 kilometers per day, and they're going to do that flight in one shot. So they're not going to stop to rest. They're just going to fall out of the air column, plop on the prairies, and they can go as far north as the Yukon to be a problem on the cold crops that are grown in northern production regions as well. So we monitor for diamondback moth. Of course, they can be significant pests of canola and of brassicaceous vegetables in the province, and we've decided to extend our trapping for 4 weeks this past year, and we'll likely continue that for this year. Reason being is we want to see what the populations are doing from a homegrown perspective. So we're looking at timing of arrival, which will give us an indication, coupled with temperature, as to what we're going to see for pressures, and then we can see what's actually happening with those populations if we continue to watch them. And happily, populations were low this past year, but you can see in July a real uptick in population of these diamondback moth. So that's that second peak we saw mid-July. Important consideration too is these animals are really well controlled by their natural enemies, especially parasitoids like Diadegma insulaire, pictured here parasitizing a diamondback larva. And these animals actually don't overwinter here. They actually follow them on their migrations. So in addition to the diamondback, we also have their natural enemies following them. Next slide, please. Thank you. Lygus bugs. Happily, few reports of spraying in 2022. Unlike 2021 with the hot, dry conditions that we saw over the season, these animals really like it dry. So when we're talking about Lygus, we're not just talking about one species, we're talking about a complex of at least 7 or 8 different species that can be economically important. They all have different host preferences, typically relatively wide host preferences. So in some cases, some species will feed on 200 to 300 different host plants. For canola, what's really important is that we've changed the nominal threshold for these ones. So for those who remember the large table based on commodity prices and cost of control, we recommend simply looking at nominal threshold of 2 to 3 per sweep at late flower to early pod, full stop. What's been demonstrated with some recent data developed by Ag Canada that supports not only this nominal threshold, but at very low levels where control might be suggested by high commodity price. We're actually seeing a potential yield benefit associated with low levels. So at 1 per sweep or low, compensatory regrowth has been demonstrated, and so that's an important consideration. So a little bit of ligas can actually be of benefit to you. For faba, flowering to mid-pod, most vulnerable, can influence yield, shedding of buds, flowers and pods, etc. Best time to control is early pod. Currently no thresholds, however, Hector Carcamo and Sean Prager are working on these, and current recommendations are for 2 per sweep, no action. Above that, consider control. Next slide, please. Once again, I mentioned they really like it hot. They like it hot and they like it dry. When things are cooler and wetter, they are subject to fungal pathogens. And 2 real important fungal pathogens are Bovaria and Metarhizium. And you can see Metarhizium here on a cockroach. You know, the fuzzy greenness on the cockroach, and the fuzzy whiteness on the Lagus here, associated with Bovaria bassiana. They're not recovering from this experience. So these animals are quite dead. Rainfall can be particularly important to young Lagus. Of course, when you are less than 1 millimeter long or 1 to 2 millimeters long, a raindrop can be a pretty significant event in your life. Can knock you off your host plant and expose you to all sorts of dangers on the ground, including natural enemies and direct drowning. Parastinus parasitoids are also important for controlling the populations of these animals, and we've got at least 2 species of Parastinus that can influence Lagus bugs. And you can see one here parasitizing a Lagus nymph. Next slide, please. So Bertha armyworm, happily, we got a bit of a good news story on this one. Populations are at a low ebb. It is a cyclical pest, but we saw very little to report in the way of Bertha numbers or Bertha damage this year. Next slide, please. So they are foliar feeders. So you can see we do have several color morphs of these animals. That yellow stripe on their sides is quite conspicuous. If it's a little bit pinker, then you're looking at clover cutworm. So once again, yeah, yellow versus pink. The damage, however, between these 2 animals is relatively indistinguishable, and control is comparable. Bertha armyworm, cyclical outbreaks, typically every 6 to 8 years. The last time we had a minor outbreak was 15-16. So yeah, question mark, outbreak coming soon. We're certainly due for one. If this cycle holds true, and we're ramping up slightly with our year-to-year trap catch, but we'll, of course, we'll continue to monitor. I don't want to make a prediction of increased populations this year. There could be a delay, but we are due for an increase in populations, and we do continue to monitor these ones. Stay tuned to the ministry website and Prairie Pest Monitoring website, or Prairie Pest Monitoring Network website, where we'll post weekly trap catches and give an indication as to what we're seeing with these populations. Next slide, please. Finally, flea beetles. Of course, flea beetles were front of mind for a lot of people. So it was a very heavy year for flea beetles and a very heavy year for grasshoppers. We had significant populations in this past year, and a lot of overspray going down for these animals. Sometimes 2, 3, and I heard a couple of reports of 4 sprays going down. We have 2 species that are primary pests: the crucifer flea beetle, Philotrida cruciferae, which seems to be more concentrated in southern regions, drier regions, and the striped flea beetle, which tends to be more concentrated in northern regions. We have been looking at a species composition shift over the last few years, but with the dry conditions, it seems some of the anthropogenic factors that might be contributing to that. So that is reduced sensitivity of striped flea beetle to some insecticides may be trumped by climate factors. So using Saskatoon area as an example, that was an area that's been in the past few years characterized by really heavy striata populations. That was almost entirely crucifery this year. And so very dry conditions seem to contribute to the success of crucifery and could contribute to greater efficacy of insecticides as well. So as I mentioned, stripe more tolerant to neonics, and some work done by Bob Elliott after the work that we did indicated they're also more tolerant to diamides. An important consideration too, and we'll maybe go to the next slide, and I'll talk about it when we're talking about control products. So looking at their life history, they overwinter as adults. So those are the bajillions of flea beetles that you see coming up in the spring. They've overwintered as adults, 1 generation per year. So what you're looking at is they're going to oviposit in the spring. They oviposit in field crops, in the canola crop. Those are going to develop. Sorry, we got the cursor on the screen there again. Thank you. So those eggs are going to develop on the canola crops, and we don't really know what the damage associated with these larvae are, but the numbers can be very high, as much as 1,500 per square meter, so very high. They're going to complete their development on their pupate in the soil and then emerge late summer as adults. So functionally 1 generation per year. You're going to see representatives from 2 generations, but a year-long generation cycle. Next slide, please. Thank you. Rather than complicating this slide, the take-home message is striolata emerges 2 weeks earlier, functionally. And really that's what this is saying. This is looking at accumulated degree days above 5 degrees Celsius. It seems that striped flea beetle is a little less heat tolerant as well than crucifer flea beetle. And there's some evidence from Chinese populations, and it does occur in China and is a major pest there, that their activity begins to decrease at about 26 degrees Celsius. So they like things a little bit cooler, they like things a little bit wetter. Crucifer flea beetle, more heat tolerant. You don't start to see that decrease in populations, into a decrease in activity, pardon me, until you start getting into the 30s, but it also means they need a little more degree day accumulation before they start to emerge in the spring. We've also got another line there, and that's HFB. That's hop flea beetle. That's a native species. That's Ciliotes punctulata, and it can be a muncher of canola. Its economic importance is not well understood. However, it's not nearly the pest that these other two are, but it can be very numerous on some sites. Next slide, please. The seed treatments that are available, we've got a number of different products. So we've got insecticides in group 4A, and you can see clothianidin, and if you look to the bottom, you've also got imidacloprid and thiamethoxam. These are efficacious products. Striped flea beetle is less sensitive to them, so arguably less effective for striped flea beetle. We also have some other members of the group 4, but different subclasses. So that is flupyridiferone, if you look about halfway down the list there. So buteostart, that's a 4D. So it's going after the same receptor site in the insect as the neonic is, but it's structurally different enough where it's considered to be a different subclass. Same thing for sulfoxaflor, it's going after the same receptor site, but structurally different enough where it's considered to be a different subclass. Both of these have good efficacy for flea beetles. Sulfoxaflor, however, is sold as a co-pack with different substances. Buteostart, reports from these, it is a premium product. It is a little bit more expensive, but reports have been excellent for its efficacy for both flea beetles in the past year. Also included are Lumiderm and Fortenza. These are cyantraniliprole or group 28s. These are particularly effective for Lepidoptera. So that is cutworms, although they contribute to flea beetle mortality as well. Next slide, please. So foliar applications, and of course, a lot of concern recently about Lambda cyhalothrin or Lambda cy. So Matador silencer labamba and Volume Express, the mixed product of a group 3 and a group 28. So Syngenta is retooling the label. They've issued a recall on these materials, and they won't be available for Matador and Volume Express. They won't be available for the upcoming field season. Last conversation with Adama was that they were optimistic that silencer would be available, and an important consideration. So that is for when you're talking about oilseed crops, for flax and for canola, and for mustard when it's used as an oilseed. Where it's not approved is mustard as a condiment. So please keep that in mind. Labamba, Chardos is going forward with availability of this product for the spring. We sent out a request to Adama yesterday to try to get an update on where they stand with that. But yeah, you now know what we know, is that they are still optimistic about availability for the upcoming field season. So even without let's say that you can get your hands on Lambda Cy products, for flea beetle control or for grasshopper control for that matter, there are a number of other products that are available. Pardon me, including a number of other group 3. So we got a lot of permethrin products, cypermethrin products, and deltamethrin products. So the mode of action of these products is identical to lambdicides. There's differences in formulation, of course, and differences in the actual chemistry, but these are all synthetic pyrethroids. They all work the same way in the insect. So you can consider these to be functionally interchangeable when it comes to flea beetle control or to grasshopper control. If you're looking at grasshopper control, group 3 is real important when they're young. So if you're looking at third instar where you just got those wing buds starting to form, that's where these products are really effective for grasshoppers. When they start to get bigger than that, you want to look at some other products. You want to look at malathion or maybe Coragen as well. Both of those products can be very effective. For flea beetles, pardon the off in the weeds moment there. There are also group 1As in the form of carbaryl and malathion 1B. We've seen fairly pronounced group 3 resistance in flea beetle populations, cabbage seed pod weevil populations, and pollen beetle populations in Europe. Okay, so that's an important consideration. Not in Western Canada, in Europe. Boyd Morey's lab has been testing for group 3 resistance in flea beetle populations from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and they have yet to detect it, but they are currently looking for it. So we haven't seen it yet. However, if we keep hitting them with the same hammer, there's a potential to select for resistance. So rotation of different modes of action is, of course, encouraged. Next slide, please. So yeah, just a little quick look at some of the different, some of the work that we did back in 2007, 2008 at differences in susceptibilities of striolata versus cruciferae, and you can see to clothianide and thiamethoxam that yeah, there are some pretty big differences. Next slide, please. Oh, important consideration. Yeah, the economic threshold, 25% defoliation when flea beetles present and active. So that's a real important consideration. If you've got damage but no flea beetles, what you're doing is revenge. You're inflicting a revenge spray on it, and you're not going to see the benefit of that. You'll actually see you're spending money unnecessarily. Economic injury at 50%. However, yeah, of course, you got flea beetles active, you got that damage, active and still feeding. You want to inflict control on those really quick, because if you get to 50%, that's the economic injury level. Next slide, please. So also recommended for flea beetle control, some cultural control methods. So plant as shallow as available moisture will allow. This will allow seedlings to germinate and emerge quickly, grow vigorously. You want to get them to that 4-leaf stage where they become very tolerant to flea beetle damage as quickly as possible. Those flea beetles are going to stay active for weeks, if not months. So once those plants are past the stage where they're sensitive, then things are much better. Early seeding, and I'm going to put a question mark after that because if you're the first canola field up, you have the potential to concentrate those flea beetle populations. So it's possible to seed too early, it's possible to seed too late, but there can be benefits to either. So I'm going to put a question mark on that one right now because we've got anecdotal accounts over the last few years that either can be beneficial or detrimental. So I think, yeah, we'll leave that with a question mark. Seed into standing stubble, this has become common practice, of course, and that contributes to a microclimate that's less suited to flea beetles and increases the matrix where their natural enemies can have an impact on them. Increased seeding rates, I realize, contrary to the current trend, but going from 5 pounds per acre to 2 pounds per acre in some cases, really what you want, the more plants you have per unit area, the per plant damage that will be experienced will be less. So you're spreading that feeding around amongst different plants. Wider row spacing is also recommended, so increasing the row spacing of to 20 to 30 centimeters can help as well. So increasing that open area. Next slide, please. Pulse pests, P aphid numbers were elevated in several pulse crops this year, and we had many reports of spraying. In peas, Scout at 5 to 75% flower, The economic threshold for these will be 2 to 3 aphids per 8-inch plant tip, 9 to 12 aphids per sweep, lentils 30 to 40 per sweep. Timing is important for insecticide application. So early insecticide application, so that is just as flowering is coming on. If you have aphid populations, is really the most effective time, and early seeding can be of great benefit to get those plants past the point where they're sensitive to aphid damage. For Faba, Ning Zhao in Sean Krieger's lab has just defended her master's thesis looking at economic thresholds, looking in part at economic thresholds for aphids in Faba, and determined that 103 to 164 aphids per main branch will give you a 7-day window for control. That is, if the aphids are continuing to increase. So you're going to want to monitor, over a few days. And if you're seeing a day-to-day increase, then this threshold applies. If you're seeing them maintain or decrease, your natural enemies are having an impact, and spray may not be necessary. Next slide, please. Important consideration for pea aphid is they're not heat lovers. So unlike grasshoppers and Christopher flea beetle and ligas that really seem to like the warm temperatures, pea aphid does not. It seems to really like it about room temperature, and even at 27 degrees Celsius, you're going to see a big die-off of juveniles. So yeah, once again, room temperature, their mortality is lowest, their fecundity is highest, and you can see from that figure on the low right that their mortality really ramps up. Another important consideration too is one of their important natural enemies is, of course, the ladybug species, and the activity of at least one ladybug species increases dramatically with temperature. So you get this increased activity of their natural enemy, reduced fecundity, reduced and greater mortality, and that can really throw populations for a loop. Big asterisks on this, as we have accounts from the past couple of years where we have regions with elevated temperatures without decreases. And it seems those areas were characterized by high humidity. So the humidity may be having a buffering effect on the effective temperature on these animals. So still teasing some of these factors out. And next slide, please. Pea leaf weevil. And this is going to be one of the last animals we talk about, if not the last. Cytona lineatus. Adults emerge in the spring, much like you see with flea beetles. They do engage in what's in a springtime flight into crops, in addition to walking. However, most of their movement into crops is by walking, and then they're not fast walkers. So you're going to see a lot of edge effects with these animals. Pardon me. Animal feeding can kill plants under high densities and reduce pod production, but it's the larvae that are really the damaging stage of these new. The top photo there, you can see a larva tunneling into a nodule, and that's what they do. They develop on peas and faba, which is their true host, much like we talked about with cabbage seed pod weevil. Their true host in the Brassicaceae. They have true host plants in the Fabaceae or legumes. They'll munch on a number of different legumes as adults, and you'll see this characteristic notch feeding. And on the lower right there, however, when it comes to development, it's really limited to peas and faba on the prairies. They consume the rhizobium in the nodules, reduce nitrogen fixation, and this can result in a yield loss. Next slide, please. So looking at the survey from 2020 and 2021, we saw a real reduction in 2020 and relatively low populations in 2021, although a bit of an increase. And next slide, please. And they came roaring back last year. So in these northeastern and eastern regions, you may want to consider seed dressings if you're planting beads, pea and faba, insecticidal seed dressings. That is the most efficacious way to control larvae. Foliar applications, the point from point A to point B, where we can say, yeah, foliar applications are efficacious, doesn't really exist. The results are quite mixed. So yeah, seed dressings are or seed treatments are the most effective strategy for controlling larval damage. And next slide, please. And with that, I'll ask people to point their phones at this QR code and or contact me directly if you want to sign up for pest monitoring programs. I believe, and I think we all believe that there is value in the maps. but we need permission to access lands to be able to sample the insects and the diseases to be able to produce the maps. So please sign up, allow us access, and we can share the data. Of course, the information that you share will be confidential and is strictly used to access those sites. And with that, I will take any questions.
James, we're actually just going to wait until after the second presentation to take all questions at once.
Oh, super. Okay, do you want to take a little 5-minute break then? Or?
Sure, we can give you, we'll give 2 minutes here for everybody to run to the washroom or grab any water you need, and then we will join back at 10 a.m. here.
Excellent.
Hey, James, it is 10 a.m. now. If you're ready, we can start the next presentation.
Ready to go.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks everyone again for joining, and thanks for your patience with our minor technical glitches. I think we have a path forward. So you can see strychnine alternatives for Richardson ground squirrel control. So that's going to be the nut of the talk that we're talking about today, and some of the work that we've done to assess some of these. So if we go to the first slide, please, or the next slide. Excellent, thank you. Oh, there we go. So Richardson's ground squirrel, you can see it's been reclassified. I know that's really big news. So it's now classified no longer in the genus Smyrlophilus. It's Ursitellus. That is the nature of systematics. They tend to find their way into different groups. That can complicate regulatory issues, though. It's typically if you're naming something by species and it changes designation by that, then there are some changes from a regulatory perspective that need to be made as well. So it is semi-fossorial, semi-social. So it's a little bit like, well, it's come up in discussion. It's a little like acreage owners. They like their space. They don't get along all that well, but they're semi-social. So and semi-fossorial means they live part of their life underground. So yeah, maybe like acreage owners as well. I live on an acreage. So native to Western North America, shortgrass prairie. So that is widely distributed across the Central Plains. Also called dak rat, Dakota rat, or flickertail for relatively obvious reasons if you watch them for any time at all. Next slide, please. So life history of these animals, the adults are only above ground for about 4 months a year, and most people are surprised to hear that. And we'll take a look at their activity in an upcoming slide. When we're talking about spring emergence, this is correlated with warming surface and air temperatures, and they can come up when things are still relatively cool. So the soil temperature is still around freezing, and you can see them active when there's still a fair bit of snow on the ground. And a real good indicator of if your ground squirrel population is active, you're going to see some predatory bird activity in your area, likely before you actually see the ground squirrels. Males are going to appear 2 weeks before the females. So they go through a period of what's called testicular recrudescence, which is, yeah, it's a mouthful, I realize, but it's a case of if you're not using them, why are you maintaining them? So their testes are gonna atrophy over the case over the summer and winter, and build up again in the spring. So their cache is what they're using to get by. So they're storing plant material in an underground bunker functionally and feeding on that. And they're using that plus their fat reserves to build up enough energy for springtime. The males are going to fight like mad. Females are only receptive for a very short time, and males to gain access to those females can engage in some pretty brutal little gopher battles. Females are going to terminate their torpor or their hybridation the day before they appear. So they're going to emerge about 2 weeks after. Next slide, please. And I mentioned before about relatively short period to inflict control on these populations, and that's really going to be a take-home message. So if you want to achieve effective control of populations, it's adult females that you want to target. You can control adult males all you want, but their impact on populations is relatively low. It doesn't take a whole lot of males to contribute to a population. So you want to get the female adults and get them early. So get them before those litters come up, and it doesn't take them very long to produce those litters. So pretty much as soon as you start seeing females, and you can distinguish the females from the males because the males are fighting functionally. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about reproduction, 1 litter per year, we do get questions all the time about this. So typically 5 to 8 per litter. I had some on my place this year, litters of 10. So they can be larger than that. The gestation is 23 days, lactation about 5 weeks. That's all conducted underground. And they're going to wean them, and then you're going to see the emergence of those litters above ground. So when you see the little ones above ground, they are functionally independent. The young are going to stay within the mother's territory while they're small. And when you're seeing a colony of ground squirrels, functionally what you're seeing is a kin group. And it's going to be dominated by females. Oftentimes it's going to be a mother, or a mother and an aunt and their female progeny, or daughters and cousins. And then around the ring of that, you're going to have males, but each individual female is going to have its own territory within that, or its own burrow system. That's going to be about 10 meters or 30 feet wide, and they're not great at sharing. So they may share their burrow with their very young female progeny initially, but eventually they really like their space. So they like each other's company conditionally. So once those females become more independent, they move a short distance from the mother's territory, particularly when populations are high. But those males are going to get driven out relatively quickly. They do their best to avoid inbreeding. So come June or July, they're going to be seeking other colonies, and they can move many kilometers. So if you're seeing a gopher on the road and sometimes in bad shape, that may be what happened there. I don't know that they hitchhiked, but that may be what happened. So they try not to mate with relatives if they stay close. This is dictated primarily by females, and females can be less than receptive to males once they have left their state of estrus. So a really important consideration for these, I did mention a short breeding period. And when I say short, I mean short. 4 hours is how long the females go into estrus every year. And so for males, it behooves them to put everything they have into accessing females. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about hibernation, so quote unquote, there are various states of hibernation, and this one is called torpor. So it is taking on the temperature of the surrounding area, and it'll be underground. It won't be below freezing, could be right around freezing. Functionally what they're doing is they're shutting down, and their heart rate slows dramatically, their metabolism slows dramatically, and they take on those ambient temperatures underground. And they're going to be beginning doing that, like the previous figure indicated. They're going to start doing that in the summer, and they'll go through short periods of torpor, followed by periods of activity, and the periods of activity will get shorter and shorter and shorter until, and I'll indicate this in an upcoming slide, where they're just going to have long periods of torpor with periods of activity where they'll stay underground, feed on their caches, and then proceed to the spring that way. So body temperature approximately the same as the surrounding soil. So yeah, they're going to have activity 4 to 6 days, July, August. In January, they're going to, or torpor 4 to 6 days, pardon me, in July and August. In January, that torpor can be extended for almost a month. And they really cool down. Their heart rate, respiration, metabolism slows dramatically, and obviously they are defenseless, as you can see being held in people's hands. So I do encourage tolerance of badgers, particularly in the late summer. Badgers can do a real number on the populations, and what they're doing, they're digging down looking for these animals in this state of torpor, in this helpless state. And they can really hammer groundhopper populations, like knock them back 60–80%. So the reason they go through this torpor, preserve fat reserves. Of course, they can't do that if they're in a period of activity. So next slide, please. So I mentioned torpor this is by age and gender. So you see adult males here, their activity is going to be extended a little bit. It starts earlier, extends a little bit, or extends a little bit later. Or starts a little bit earlier, ends a little bit earlier, pardon me, than females. Juvenile males, however, their behavior is going to be extended quite late, and you can see here, right into October. And typically late summer, early fall, what you're seeing the teenagers. So, I mean, juvenile males are not going to contribute very much to the next generation. They can cause some damage, but again, if you're wanting to impact this population in a significant way, hit them early and hit the adult females. Next slide, please. So they're sealing themselves off. They dig a new exit in the spring. So I mentioned before timing and duration of torpor by adult and sex. So they have a hibernation chamber. They also have several other chambers in their burrow system. And remember, these burrow systems are individual. So really, we're looking at a repetition of the points that I covered in the previous slide. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So populations increased during extended periods of warm and dry weather, and we certainly saw that in 2021. We did have some timely rains in 2022, and we had a reduction in gopher populations. So the wet conditions and the cool conditions contribute to bacterial and fungal infections in these animals, much like you see in some insect populations, and this can knock them back. So, particularly in eastern regions, we saw in some areas relatively low populations of Richardson's ground squirrel. So I mentioned before, tolerance of predators can be important to control these animals. So coyotes can be important predators, foxes, badgers can be tremendously important. And I realize that some people have very low tolerance for badgers and will shoot them on sight. Their burrows do cause a lot of damage, but they really do a number on Richardson's ground squirrel populations. So shooting, trapping, drowning can also impact populations, with an asterisk there. I think in the Southwest, they sold out of 22 cartridges. So yeah, I don't know how effective shooting actually was. Poisoning is the go-to. So there are some anticoagulants. So that is chlorphacinone available in several products, diphacinone available as Ramic Green. There's aluminum phosphide as gas toxin. There's some zinc phosphide products, white mustard seed powder, sodium alpha olefin sulfonate, and this is available as a toxicant as well. 2% liquid strychnine is by far the most widely used in Saskatchewan. And of course, everyone is aware. If we can go to the next slide, please. So a bit of a recent history. Everyone is aware, I'm certain, that the final decision came down from PMRA to deregister, and this final use is permitted until March 4th of this year. So if you have stores, it's no longer permitted for sale. It's no longer permitted for manufacture. So if you have stores, you're allowed to use it until March 4th. Any use after that is not, strictly speaking, legal, and we don't encourage it. So manufacturing was permitted till March 2021, sale till March 2022, and the phase out completes March 2023. Both Saskatchewan and Alberta and 37 other organizations submitted letters of objection to the final decision document in April of 2020, and they proceeded with the deregistration. So Agrimax is the manufacturer, was the manufacturer of this material. They experienced significant supply chain issues associated with COVID and requested a stay of the phase-out period. We supported that and indicated that to PMRA, but unfortunately the phase-out proceeded. So we are still looking at March 4th for phase-out of this material. However, next slide, please. It's not all doom and gloom. We looked at comparative efficacy and non-target mortality of some of the products that are available, and we wanted to look at the products that are in ready-to-use formulations. So the materials that are easy to use, you don't need special training, you don't need special licensure. So if you are a commercial grower, you can use these products. And so we compared them from an efficacy and non-target mortality perspective to strychnine, as would normally be used, and burrow oat bait. Pardon me, the commercial name does not have ZP in it, but it is a zinc phosphide formulation, so that's why it's included there. The other zinc phosphide formulation we looked at was ZP rodent oat bait, AG, and the full names will be indicated in a further slide. Rosol RTU, or ready to use, and Ramic Green. So these are all ready to use products. In the case of the zinc phosphide products, these are treated oat bait. So they come in 50-pound bags, you fire a spoon and you fire it down the hole. Very easy to use. Be sure to wear a mask, of course. Each were replicated 3 times on different sites. Yeah, occurrence one time is a fluke, which is why you want to see replication, of course. We looked at 40-meter by 40-meter plots, each separated by at least 1 kilometer between treatments, or 250 meters between the same treatment. We didn't want to mistake potential effects on non-targets from one site or one treatment with another, and we opted for a 1 kilometer distance to be able to assess that. We also put 2 game cams on a central post in the middle of this, in the middle of each plot, and reviewed the photographic evidence from each of these plots to look at A, gopher activity, and B, the activity of non-target animals as well. We had a plan to submit any non-targets that were found to be killed as part of the study for necropsy to the Western College of Veterinary Medicine. However, happily, no non-targets were found as part of the study. So it didn't kill anything but gophers. So 2 days prior to treatment, we established baseline counts. So that is careful observation with binoculars of the sites to determine what the population was, application of treatments, and then followed by 7 days of daily observation to determine population reduction. Next slide, please. So, there's Raul Avila setting up some of our cameras. Next slide, please. And we had a bit of a delay in the Maple Creek area. So important point, we did this as a collaborative study, both with Alberta and ourselves. And we had the participation of the SARM PHOs, of course, the Alberta Municipal District and Rural Municipality personnel, and of course our volunteer landowner collaborators who we couldn't have done this work without. However, yeah, in the Southwest Saskatchewan, we had some delays associated with snow. So next slide, please. So when this finally got rolling, we got the baits applied. So that's Joanne Kwasnicki, the plant health officer for the Southwest, and Rich Wilkins, our reg specialist. Next slide, please. So it was all hands on deck effort. Looking at the results of this study, this is from Saskatchewan, and the different letters indicate significant differences if the letters are different. So you take a look at the lower right. When we're talking about population reduction, strychnine, burrow oat bait, and ZP rodent oat bait, so that is the 2 zinc phosphide products, are efficacious. So we were looking at 80% knockdown in the populations associated with those. Not a significant difference with Ramic Green, but survivorship was numerically higher, and Rosal survivorship was significantly higher. Next slide, please. Looking at the Alberta data, of course, they experienced a lot of the snow conditions that we had, and we saw a reduction, or they saw a reduction in activity on their sites. Significant reduction in populations associated with the treatments, but we needed to correct for that cold weather effect. And if you go to the next slide, please. Of course, there are statistical means to do things, and this is commonly used in insecticide resistance or insecticide efficacy work. It's called a Schneider or Rayleigh correction. So just take the previous slide, turn it upside down. We're looking at mortality here, and it's showing functionally the same thing. So it's really just a reassurance. This takes into account any reduction in the control group, activity or survivorship. So they saw pretty good results from all of their treatments as well. Next slide, please. So again, important consideration with all baits is timing. So timing. You want to get it when those females first start to come up and before the litters come out. So best results achieved if baits applied, as they're emerging from overwintering, or as females are emerging from overwintering, before that spring green up occurs. You can get a bit of bait shyness once green plants come up. They do taste a little bit better than the baits, so take that into consideration. An important consideration with anticoagulants too is that fresh plant material, particularly legumes, can be rich in vitamin K. Vitamin K is the antidote to first generation anticoagulants. So you can see greatly reduced efficacy, particularly if you're surrounded by legume. There are no antidotes for strychnine or zinc phosphide. And next slide, please. We also did an economic analysis of what it costs to put this down. Of course, the mantra has always been, strychnine is best, strychnine is cheapest. Not really the case. So when we looked at a per acre application at the high rate, the high label rate associated with each of these products, we found strychnine about $13 an acre, burrow oat bait $4.54, ZP rodent oat bait $8.80. So these are actually less expensive than strychnine to use and as efficacious. With the anticoagulants, you could be and likely are looking at multiple applications, and that's an important consideration when we look at our efficacy data. Is we did actually put down multiple applications, at least 2 applications of each of those anticoagulants, and we still saw reduced efficacy with the anticoagulants in the Saskatchewan trials, comparable efficacy in the Alberta trials, but those still require multiple applications. So this is a per application cost. For Rosehall, of course, you double that, 2 applications, that becomes $30 an acre. Ramic green, you can put down as many as 3 applications according to label directions. Yeah, that puts you up into the $30 an acre realm as well. So next slide, please. So yeah, all of our contributors, we had a lot of people helping out with this, both in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And rather than reading everyone's name out, I'll just give a moment for you to read that out. And I believe with that, I can take some questions.
Thank you, James, for that great presentation. As a reminder, if you have any questions today, please enter them into the chat box on the bottom of your control panel. And we do have a few questions here. The first question is, do cutworms come in cycles? I've been told they come in 10-year cycles. We've had a couple fields that needed to be reseeded last year because of black cutworms. Can we expect increased cutworm problems in the growing year of 2023?
Complicated question. Yeah, it seems reasonable that yes. I haven't seen any data to indicate that's the case. So you did mention black cutworm, which I think is an excellent point. Is we're talking about at least 15 species of economically important cutworms, and so it's really difficult to generalize over all of these. And my previous point too is I haven't seen data to indicate the cyclical nature of their populations. What I have seen is the response of these populations to environmental factors, like in the case of pale western and redback cutworm to dry conditions. So afraid I haven't got a full answer for you.
Thanks, James. Second question we have is there any ongoing work looking at potential flea beetle resistance to both insecticide seed treatments and foliar insecticides? It seems we are losing efficacy in combination with having excessive populations.
Yeah, no, it's I'll address the first part first. Is Dr. Boyd Morey at the University of Alberta is currently has a postdoc or a postdoctoral fellow who is dedicated to looking at insecticide efficacy. So the work that she has done has indicated that there is no group 3 resistance in these populations, and their plan, and I believe they've done some work on seed dressings as well, on seed treatments. So the commercially available seed treatments. Yeah, so they're doing that work, some the efficacy data and some molecular work, to my knowledge, to look at some of the genetic factors that could be contributing to differences that we're seeing between stripes and crucifer flea beetles. So a real important consideration there is when we're talking about striped flea beetle, we're talking about tolerance. So we haven't selected for resistance in striped flea beetle. It really just comes out of the box more tolerant to these insecticides.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Next question is, do you see much for zebra caterpillar damage in canola?
Yeah, damage. You do see them. You do see them relatively frequently, albeit at low numbers. Almost never an economic pest.
Thank you. Next question is, You mentioned about the microclimate of standing stubble is less suited to flea beetles. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think some of the thinking has been that it increases humidity, which in the case of crucifer flea beetle, at any rate, they seem to dislike. Um, yeah, touching on specific factors, I think probably what's more important is that matrix. So it interferes with their movement, and it's it's a lot of places for natural enemies to hide.
Thank you. Next question. How long can gophers live for?
Yeah, in captivity versus they are actually kept as pets in part of the world. Japan, I think China, they were all the rage for a time. So I don't have any data from there. 3 to 4 years is a pretty long-lived gopher on the prairies.
Thanks, James. Next question. What is the reason for banning strychnine?
Multifold, or the reasons that were forwarded by Pest Management Regulatory Agency included, and I'll just indicate what they indicated, and maybe discuss my thoughts on the rationale for some of those. One was the potential threat to non-target species, particularly species at risk. And one of the examples that came up was ferruginous hawk. So ferruginous hawk is almost entirely dependent on Richardson's ground squirrel as a food source for their fledglings. It is has been considered to be included as a threatened species. I think they've backed away from that currently. So in my experience and in some of the published literature, what's been indicated is that hawks are quite sensitive to the taste of strychnine. And I mentioned that strychnine is very bitter, and we did a research trial in 2019 where we had hawk visitation. We had hawk feeding on gophers that were poisoned by strychnine, and what we found was that they would actually cut the guts out of these animals. It kills quickly enough where the toxin is actually limited to the alimentary canal and doesn't work its way into the muscle tissue, unlike where you might see with the anticoagulants, where those toxins are actually working their way throughout the animal, and arguably represent a much greater threat to non-targets. In the case of strychnine, it doesn't do that. It's limited to the alimentary canal. And the hawks, these were sharp-shinned hawks that would show up to our plots, cut the guts out of the hawks. And I had one that was particularly OCD that would actually line them up in a row. Funny hawk, but anyway, so that they could feast on the animal without it being exposed to the toxin. Also saw that with game camera footage with a badger pulling a gopher that had been killed by strychnine out of a hole, biting into it, experiencing that bitter taste, and immediately dropping it and running away. So, and of course, we searched the area and didn't find a dead badger. So we're assuming the badger was just fine. So yeah, this effect on non-targets is a potential problem. I think that can be mediated very strongly through following label directions. The label directions, of course, include getting it down the hole. Where we were running into problem was, if people would broadcast the material, and I can't pretend I didn't see it, that people would do that, and that was part of the problem. So it wasn't frequent, it was a rare occurrence, but it did occur. So if you follow label directions, it didn't represent a problem to non-targets. The toxicity was also something that was raised, and I would argue that if you want an efficacious product and you want significant knockdown of a pest, you want high toxicity to that pest. So, I mean, to my mind, that argument didn't make sense. And really, that was the crux of the argument for deregistration.
Thanks, James. The next question is, what is the best way to apply poison? Dump it directly in the hole, beside the hole, or in a trap?
Yeah, well, no, that varies. So with, as I mentioned with strychnine, obviously it's not broadcast. And you can't use bait stations with strychnine either. With the zinc phosphide products that we tested, you are permitted to use those in bait stations or fire them down the hole. But those are really your two options. Similar for Ramic and Rosol. If you choose to use the anticoagulants, and I know some guys really like them, but you know, you do have the opportunity for bait stations or firing them down the hole. Bait stations, of course, are considerably less labor intensive, but consider how many gophers are going to be exposed to those. You know, that territoriality of gophers. Remember that, you know, an individual gopher's territory is about 30 feet. So, you know, you're going to be limited to the numbers of gophers that are going to be exposed to that bait station. So, you know, you may have greater efficacy if you fire them into individual holes.
Thanks, James. Next question we have is, does Rosol lose its efficacy over time if not consumed immediately?
In the field or in storage? I'm assuming that probably means in the field. In short, I don't
say that, but yeah.
Yeah, in short, I don't know. I'll offer you a question mark on that one. What has been demonstrated, though, is that strychnine in storage loses its punch year to year. So,
okay. The next question is, where do we purchase these gopher control alternatives?
Oh, and that's from retailers. So talk to your retailer. Talk to your retailer early. Talk to them often. Ask them about getting these products in. One of the zinc phosphide products that we tested is distributed by Ag Products Limited, and the other one is distributed by Viceroy Distributing. So if your retailer can't get a hold of them, then maybe you can contact the distributor directly. But your retailer should be able to get them in or contact those distributors and facilitate you getting them. But they're all commercially available, whereas strychnine, of course, was only in participating RMs and only available to ratepayers of that RM, and only for sale, through the RM office. So availability was, we will say, more limited. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Sorry. So the last question is, colder soil temperatures and earlier seeding have created more problems with flea beetles. It appears that seeding date is a major factor in control requirements. Any way to reduce impact on early seeded crops, and are there insecticides that work better with early seeding?
I'm going to address this from a seed dressing perspective with early seeding crops, and I haven't seen evidence or data to indicate that there are differences in efficacy amongst the seed treatments. Where you're going to see temperature effects, and this has more to do with high temperatures than low temperatures, are between group 3s and 1Bs. So at higher temperatures, and I realize that the person asking the question is probably asking about cooler temperatures. So I'll try to address this in a context of warmer temperatures. So when you get to that 25C level, synthetic pyrethroids efficacy decreases. So it begins to decrease there. So you don't want to be using that one under hot conditions. So it could be argued that might be a better one for cool conditions, or a better class of insecticides under cool conditions, or a group of insecticides. Where you're looking at the 1Bs, malathion, for example, the efficacy of that one actually increases with temperature. So, as metabolic rates increase and the rate of efficacy of malathion actually increases. I haven't seen data, or I'm not aware of data for carbaryl for 7, but in the case of malathion, that's, yeah, if it's cool, yeah, group 3 would make more sense to me. If it's hot, then a 1B.
Okay, thanks, James. I don't see any more questions. So with that, I would like to thank you, James, for all that great information, and we appreciate the time you took to join us here today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks everybody for patience with technical hiccups.
Thanks. At this time, we would like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us for the event. Don't forget to use the QR code on the screen to get credit for the